Did you bring the same $45 blue synthetic polyester suitcase you packed for me when you threw me out into the blinding December snow at 16 years old? That was the first question I asked, my voice cutting through the humid evening air of my porch like a surgical scalpel. I stood there, leaning against the doorframe of the cottage I had bought with my own hard-earned savings, looking my mother straight in her bloodshot, tired eyes. She didn't offer a hug, she didn't offer a trembling hand, and she certainly didn't say the words, "I'm sorry." Instead, she adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, a cognac leather Michael Kors tote that likely cost more than my first 3 months of rent, and let out a shaky, desperate breath. "Gerald is dying, Presley," she said, her voice thin and brittle like old parchment. "You are his only match. My name is Presley Dixon. I am 28 years old, and I am a senior ER nurse at a Level 1 trauma center in the heart of downtown Philadelphia. I spend my 12-hour shifts navigating the chaotic border between life and death, stitching up gunshot wounds, managing cardiac arrests, and keeping my composure while the world around me falls apart. I handle high-stakes tragedy every single day, but I realized in that moment that nothing I have ever seen in the trauma bay was as cold or as calculated as the woman standing on my porch under the dim glow of my LED security light. But I'm getting ahead of myself, caught up in the visceral shock of her presence. To understand why those words felt like a death sentence of their own, I have to take you back to the night the blue suitcase became the symbol of my exile. It was December 14th, 2012. The temperature in Oak Haven, Pennsylvania, had plummeted to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and a nor'easter was dumping inches of heavy, wet snow onto the suburban lawns. My stepfather, Gerald Dixon, a man who viewed my existence as a budgetary error in his carefully curated life, had decided he was finished with me. Gerald was a mid-level executive at a regional logistics firm, a man who obsessed over spreadsheets and the pristine condition of his silver 2011 Lexus ES 350. He had accused me of stealing $200 from his mahogany dresser, a sum I later found out my younger brother, the golden child Leo, had taken to buy a modified gaming console. But the truth didn't matter to Gerald. He wanted me gone. My mother, Elena, stood in the hallway of their 4-bedroom colonial home on Maple Drive, a house that smelled of expensive cinnamon candles and suppressed resentment. She didn't defend me. She didn't even look at me. She simply went into the basement, grabbed a cheap, dusty blue suitcase we had bought for a middle school field trip to Washington, D.C., and began throwing my mismatched socks, 2 pairs of jeans, and my high school hoodies into it. She zipped it shut with a violent tug that nearly broke the plastic teeth of the zipper and handed it to me. "We can't have this disharmony in the house, Presley," she had whispered, her eyes fixed on the framed family portrait behind me where I had been strategically cropped to the edge. "Gerald says it's for the best." I remember the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place. It was a heavy, metallic thud that resonated in my chest. I stood on the sidewalk, my sneakers soaking through within minutes, clutching that $45 suitcase like a life raft. I had exactly $12.42 in my pocket and nowhere to go. I survived because of a biology teacher who noticed the bruises of exhaustion under my eyes and a series of foster homes that were more like transit hubs than havens. I put myself through nursing school working 3 jobs, living on generic ramen that cost 18 cents a pack and caffeine pills. I built a life of steel and competence while they lived in their manicured bubble. Now, 12 years later, the bubble had burst, and Elena had tracked me down to my sanctuary. She stood there on my porch, the scent of her expensive Chanel No. 5 perfume clashing with the earthy smell of the rain-slicked cedar. Her face was a map of the years she had spent enabling a tyrant, fine lines around her mouth and a permanent furrow in her brow. She looked at my scrub top, the navy blue fabric embroidered with my name and title in white thread, and I could see her calculating my value. I wasn't her daughter to her. I was a biological resource, a repository of healthy tissue and compatible blood. "Gerald's kidneys are failing," she continued, her voice gaining a frantic edge as she realized I wasn't moving. "End-stage renal disease. He's been on the UNOS waiting list for 14 months, but his blood type is rare, B negative, just like yours. Leo wasn't a match. I'm not a match. You're the only one left, Presley. We checked the records. We knew you were nursing at the trauma center. The mention of the records sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. I thought about the HIPAA violations they must have skirted, the way they used their connections to peer into my private life after a decade of silence. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the utter lack of shame. She expected me to forget the night of the blue suitcase. She expected me to walk into a surgical suite at a hospital like the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, lay down on a gurney, and let a surgeon carve out a piece of myself to save a man who wouldn't even let me sleep in his guest room. I thought about the cost of a kidney transplant. The surgery itself can run upwards of $250,000, not to mention the lifelong cost of immunosuppressant drugs that can exceed $1,500 a month. Gerald probably had top-tier insurance, the kind of Cigna or Blue Cross Gold plan that would cover the bulk of it, while I had spent years praying I wouldn't get sick because I couldn't afford the deductible on my student health plan. I shifted my weight, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back from a 12-hour shift where I had treated 3 different patients for opioid overdoses and 1 elderly man with a broken hip. My hands, scrubbed raw from industrial-grade sanitizer, were steady. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, a cracked but functional iPhone 13. I didn't call the police. I didn't call for backup. I simply looked at the woman who had given birth to me and then discarded me like a piece of faulty machinery. "You didn't even ask how I was," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You didn't ask if I was happy, if I was married, if I ever finished school. You didn't ask about the scars on my soul from the years of being nobody's child. You came here because you need a part. You're treating me like a salvage yard for Gerald's broken body." Elena's lip trembled, but it wasn't out of guilt. It was out of fear that her mission would fail. "We're family, Presley. Blood is blood." I let out a sharp, jagged laugh that startled a crow from a nearby oak tree. "Blood is just a fluid I clean off the floor of Trauma Room 4, Elena. Family is the person who holds the door open when the world is freezing over. Family is the person who doesn't pack your life into a $45 suitcase because their husband is having a tantrum." I stepped back, preparing to close the door, but she reached out, her manicured hand, nails painted a soft, mocking shell pink, grabbing the edge of the wood. "Please," she begged. "He's dying. The doctors say he has 6 months, maybe less, without a transplant. He's at the dialysis center 3 times a week, 4 hours a day. It's killing him." I thought about the dialysis clinics I had seen, the rows of chairs, the hum of the Fresenius machines, the pale, exhausted faces of patients whose lives were measured in liters of filtered blood. I knew the technical details of Gerald's suffering better than she did. I knew the glomerular filtration rate he must be sitting at, probably somewhere in the single digits. I knew the metallic taste in his mouth from the uremia and the itching of his skin from the phosphorus buildup. But I also knew the feeling of the ice-cold slush of a Pennsylvania winter soaking into my only pair of shoes. I knew the sound of my own stomach growling in a library because I had to choose between a bus pass and a sandwich. I looked past her to the street, where a black 2023 Mercedes-Benz S-Class sat idling at the curb. The headlights were crisp, blue-white beams that illuminated the rain. Gerald was likely sitting in the back, too weak to walk up the path, sending his messenger to negotiate for his life. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. They had ignored my existence for 12 years, through my graduations, through my heartbreaks, through my triumphs, and now they were parked in front of my hard-won home, demanding my flesh. "I have files too, Elena," I said, my voice regaining its professional, detached clip. "I have the records of every night I spent in a shelter. I have the police report from when I was picked up for vagrancy at 17 because I had nowhere to go. I have the bank statements showing the zero balance I carried for years while Gerald was buying his 3rd Lexus. I am a nurse. My job is to save lives, but my job is also to recognize when a patient is beyond help, or when a situation is toxic beyond repair. I walked back into my entryway, my feet silent on the hardwood floors I had polished myself. "I'm going to give you 1 minute to get off my property," I told her. "If that Mercedes is still idling at the curb in 60 seconds, I'm calling the precinct. And tell Gerald that he should have thought about his blood type before he decided that his daughter was disposable. He's looking for a match, but he forgot that a transplant requires more than just compatible antigens. It requires a donor who hasn't been hollowed out by the person asking for the gift." Elena stood there, her mouth hanging open, the realization finally sinking in that her power over me had evaporated the moment she zipped that blue suitcase. I didn't wait for her response. I closed the door, the heavy oak frame clicking shut with a sound that was far more satisfying than the deadbolt on Maple Drive had ever been. I leaned my back against the door, listening to the muffled sound of her heels retreating down the stairs and the low growl of the Mercedes engine as it pulled away into the night. My name is Presley Dixon, and for the first time in 12 years, the cold didn't bother me at all. The contrast between the life they forced me into and the one they enjoyed at my expense was not just a bitter pill to swallow. It was a physical slap in the face that stung every single time I checked my bank balance or looked at the red-rimmed eyes of the patients I cared for. My mother, Colleen, and my stepfather, Gerald, lived in a sprawling 4,200-square-foot colonial on Maple Lane, a house that boasted a triple-car garage, a professional-grade kitchen with sub-zero appliances, and a manicured lawn that cost more to maintain each month than I earned in a fortnight. Meanwhile, I spent my 17th and 18th birthdays in a cramped $650 a month studio apartment on the edge of the industrial district, where the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor's television through the drywall and the radiator hissed like a dying animal every time the temperature dropped below freezing. I was working 60-hour weeks as a certified nursing assistant, a grueling and often thankless job that paid a measly $8.60 an hour, just to scrape together enough for the community college tuition that should have been a non-issue. The reality of my situation was a jagged glass edge against my throat because I knew the truth about the money that was supposed to be mine. While I was pulling double shifts in the geriatric ward, changing soiled linens and holding the hands of the dying for less than $10 an hour, Gerald was systematically blowing my $14,300 college fund at the blackjack tables of the Borgata and Caesars in Atlantic City. Every single cent of that money had been saved by my grandma Vivian, a woman who had worked 30 years as a telephone operator and saved her spare change in vintage Maxwell House coffee cans until she could deposit it into a high-yield savings account for her only granddaughter's future. She had intended for that money to be my bridge to a better life, a shield against the very poverty I was now drowning in, but Gerald saw it as a personal slush fund for his gambling addiction and his vanity. He had the audacity to swan around their colonial home wearing $400 Stetson hats, specifically the Skyline 6X beaver fur felt model in silver belly, purchased with the very funds that were meant to pay for my textbooks and my clinical rotations. Every time I saw a photo of him on social media, looking smug in his expensive Western wear while standing next to his silver 2011 Lexus ES350, I felt a surge of cold, concentrated fury because I knew that the felt on his head was bought with my stolen future. I was surviving on generic 30-cent packages of Maruchan ramen and drinking tap water to save on groceries, while he was doubling down on a soft 17 with money that didn't belong to him. The technicality of their theft was what hurt the most. The way they leveraged their legal guardianship to drain the account Grandma Vivian had foolishly entrusted to them as trustees before she passed away from a stroke in 2010. I remember the day I went to the branch of PNC Bank on Main Street to inquire about the balance for my freshman year deposit, only to have the teller look at me with a mixture of pity and confusion as she explained that the account had been closed 6 months prior after a series of large cash withdrawals. Gerald hadn't even had the decency to hide it. He had simply transferred the funds to his checking account and headed south on the Garden State Parkway to the casinos. My mother, Colleen, stood by and watched it happen. her silence acting as a signature on every withdrawal slip he signed. She preferred the peace of a quiet house and a husband who wasn't throwing chairs to the dignity and education of her own daughter. To her, my struggle was a secondary concern to Gerald's moods, and if my college fund bought her a few months of a calm husband, she considered it a fair trade. I spent my nights in that studio apartment studying by the light of a $10 desk lamp from a thrift store, my anatomy and physiology textbooks propped up against a pile of unpaid utility bills. My rent was $650, my electricity averaged about $85 in the winter because of the drafty windows, and my bus pass was another $70 a month, leaving me with almost nothing for the basic necessities of life. I would sit there, my back aching from lifting patients who weighed twice as much as I did, and I would calculate how many hours of labor it took to earn back just one of Gerald's Stetson hats. At $8.60 an hour, after taxes, it took me nearly 60 hours of cleaning bedpans and feeding stroke victims just to afford the hat he wore to a Friday night steakhouse dinner. The math of my life was a constant reminder of their betrayal, a ledger of suffering that I kept in the back of my mind like a sacred text. I worked at a long-term care facility called Oakview Manor, a place that smelled of industrial bleach and overcooked cabbage, where the staffing ratios were dangerous and the morale was non-existent. As a CNA, I was the boots on the ground, the one who saw the skin breakdowns and the tears of the lonely, while my parents were hosting cocktail parties in their granite-clad kitchen. I learned more about humanity in those 12-hour shifts than my mother had learned in her entire life of suburban comfort. I learned how to be steady when someone was screaming in pain, how to be meticulous with documentation to protect myself and my patients, and how to find a pocket of strength when my body was screaming for sleep. I was becoming a nurse through fire and exhaustion, while Gerald was becoming a bankrupt loser in a high-end hat. The contrast was most brutal during the holidays. For my 19th birthday, I worked a double shift because the holiday pay was time and a half, bringing my hourly wage up to a staggering $12.90 for those few hours. I spent my birthday evening in the break room, eating a lukewarm container of generic pasta salad and watching the snow fall against the parking lot of the medical center. I checked my phone to see a post from my brother Leo showing the family gathered around a 20-pound organic turkey in the Maple Lane dining room. There was Gerald, grinning like a Cheshire cat, his latest Stetson resting on the sideboard, and my mother glowing under the light of a Swarovski crystal chandelier. They didn't call. They didn't text. They didn't send a card with a $20 bill inside. I was dead to them because I was a reminder of their crime, a living witness to the fact that they had robbed a child to fund a gambler's high. I remember the specific smell of the nursing home that night, a mix of floor wax and the floral scent of the cheap lotion I used on Mrs. Gable's paper-thin skin. Mrs. Gable was 89 and had no family left, and as I rubbed the lotion into her hands, she looked at me and said, "You have the hands of someone who knows what things cost, dear." She was right. I knew exactly what everything cost. I knew the cost of a gallon of milk, the cost of a late fee on a credit card, and the cost of a mother's loyalty. I was paying for my education in blood, sweat, and the loss of my youth, while my parents were living in a colonial fortress built on the ruins of my grandmother's dreams. But as I sat in that $650 studio, looking at the flickering fluorescent light in the hallway, I realized that the steel I was building inside myself was something Gerald could never buy, and my mother could never steal. I was becoming a senior ER nurse before I ever even put on the white coat, because I was already learning how to survive a trauma that would have broken anyone else. I was 28 now, standing on my own porch, but the memory of that ramen and those 80-cent shifts was as fresh as the rain in the air, a reminder that while they had the house and the hats, I had the truth, and the truth was about to become the most expensive thing Gerald Dixon ever encountered. I thought about the $14,300 often. It wasn't just a number, it was 357 Stetson hats. It was 22 months of my rent. It was a used Honda Civic that wouldn't break down on the way to the hospital. It was the difference between sleeping 4 hours a night and sleeping 8. Gerald had gambled away my sleep, my safety, and my peace of mind. He had treated my life like a chip on a felt table, betting that I would simply disappear into the statistics of foster care and low-wage labor. He hadn't counted on the fact that Grandma Vivian's grit lived in me, not in the bank account he drained. Every time I had to choose between buying a new pair of nursing clogs or paying my heating bill, I added another line to the mental invoice I was preparing for them. My mother would say I was being dramatic if she knew. She would say that Gerald had a disease and we all had to make sacrifices for the family. But I wasn't part of the family when the money was being spent, only when the organs were failing. The hypocrisy was a suffocating shroud, but I was finally reaching for the shears to cut myself free. Standing there in my navy scrubs, looking at her cognac leather bag, I realized that the $8.60 an hour I earned as a teenager had bought me more character than their millions ever would, and that was a debt they could never hope to repay. The date was November 14th, 2014, a day that remains etched into the architecture of my memory like a scar on a sapling, marking the exact moment my childhood was forcibly terminated by the people who were supposed to protect it. The atmospheric temperature in Oak Haven had plummeted to a biting 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was thick with the kind of damp, bone-chilling humidity that makes the cold feel like a physical weight pressing against your lungs. I remember the exact weight of the paper in my hand, a standard 80-gram white bond paper bank statement from PNC Bank that I had found sitting on the mahogany console table in the foyer, addressed to the estate of Vivian Dixon with Gerald listed as the primary custodian. My heart had stopped when my eyes found the bottom line of the summary page, where the figure $14,300 had once stood as a beacon of my future, now replaced by a staggering and pathetic balance of $217 remaining. There was no market crash to blame, no medical emergency that could justify the depletion, only a string of ATM withdrawals at the Borgata Hotel Casino and Spa in Atlantic City that tracked Gerald's weekend binges like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to my own ruin. When I confronted Gerald in the kitchen, my voice trembling not with fear but with the sheer, unadulterated shock of the betrayal, I didn't get an explanation or a tearful apology for the theft of my grandmother's legacy. Instead, I saw a flash of animalistic panic in his eyes that quickly curdled into a violent, defensive rage as he realized his secret was out. And before I could even finish the sentence about the missing tuition money, he lunged across the granite island. He grabbed my right wrist with a grip so ferocious and unrelenting that I could feel the bones of my forearm grinding together under the pressure of his thumb and fingers, a physical manifestation of his need to silence the witness to his greed. He squeezed with a calculated cruelty, his face inches from mine, smelling of expensive single-malt scotch and the peppermint gum he used to hide it. And the pain was a white-hot spike that radiated all the way up to my shoulder. That evening, as the adrenaline began to fade, the skin bloomed into a horrific 4-inch purple contusion, a deep, mottled hematoma that traced the exact shape of his hand and served as a silent, bruised testament to the fact that I was no longer a daughter in this house, but a liability. My mother, Colleen, didn't move to intervene, nor did she scream for him to stop. She simply stood on the bottom step of our grand, polished oak staircase, her knuckles white as she clutched a damp kitchen towel she had been using to wipe down the Sub-Zero refrigerator. She watched through a veil of cowardice as her husband, the man who was wearing a $400 Stetson hat while he broke his stepdaughter's arm, manhandled me toward the front door with the same lack of emotion one might show when taking out the trash. The transition from the warmth of the heated colonial to the unforgiving bite of the November air was instantaneous and violent as Gerald kicked the front door open, the heavy wood swinging on its brass hinges with a sound like a gunshot. He didn't just ask me to leave. He physically threw that $45 blue synthetic suitcase, the one my mother had packed with such efficient, chilling haste, out onto the frozen planks of the porch. I heard the hollow thud of the plastic wheels hitting the wood, a sound that signaled the end of my life as I knew it, and then I was shoved out after it, my sneakers skidding on the light dusting of frost that had begun to form on the porch. I was 16 years old, I was coatless, wearing nothing but a thin cotton long-sleeved shirt and my school jeans, and I was standing under the flickering yellow glow of a single 60-watt porch light that hummed with a low, dying frequency. The most haunting part of that night wasn't the cold or the bruise forming on my wrist, but the mechanical sounds of my family retreating behind the safety of their wealth. I heard the heavy mechanical thud of the double-bolt Schlager lock engaging, followed immediately by the sharp metallic click of the security chain being slid into its track. It was a rhythmic, two-step execution of our relationship, a sound that told me the borders were closed and the person I used to be was officially dead to the people inside. I stood there for a heartbeat, my breath hitching in the 38-degree air, watching the condensation of my own gasping breaths rise like ghosts in the dim light, hoping against all logic that the door would swing back open and my mother would choose me over the man who had robbed me. But 5 seconds later, the 60-watt bulb overhead flickered one last time and died as someone inside, likely Gerald with his hand still warm from the violence he'd inflicted on my wrist, flipped the switch, plunging me into a total, suffocating darkness that matched the void in my chest. The silence of the neighborhood was absolute, punctuated only by the distant hum of a neighbor's HVAC system and the soft rustle of dead oak leaves skittering across the pavement of Maple Lane. I was a child with $217 left of a life that had been worth tens of thousands, standing on a porch that was no longer mine, realizing that the heat and the light were privileges that could be revoked by a gambler in a Stetson. The purple mark on my wrist began to throb in rhythm with my heartbeat, the cold air turning the injury into a dull, aching weight. And I realized then that the woman standing on the stairs with the damp towel had performed a final act of bookkeeping. She had balanced the books by subtracting her daughter and adding a husband who would keep her house quiet, even if that silence was bought with the blood and the future of her firstborn child. I reached down and gripped the handle of the blue suitcase, the plastic cold and brittle against my palm, and I felt the first true realization of my own solitude settle into my marrow like the frost on the grass. There was no one coming to save me because the people who were supposed to be my rescue team were the ones who had locked the door and set the alarm. I looked at the dark windows of the house, the 4,200 square feet of space where I had grown up, and I realized that every brick and every shingle was a lie, a facade of stability built on the quicksand of Gerald's addiction and Colleen's complicity. My 16-year-old brain was already shifting into a survival mode I didn't know I possessed, a clinical, cold-blooded assessment of the situation that would one day make me the best ER nurse in the city. I checked my pockets. My phone had a 42% charge, I had no gloves, no scarf, and the bruise on my arm was already turning a darker, more sinister shade of plum under the moonlight. I thought about the $217, which represented exactly 25 hours of Gerald's blackjack play, and I realized that my entire worth in that house had been less than a single hand at a high-stakes table. As I began to walk down the driveway, my footsteps echoing on the asphalt. I didn't cry because the cold was too sharp for tears, and my body needed every ounce of warmth it could generate just to keep my heart beating. I passed Gerald's Lexus, the silver paint shimmering under the streetlights like a taunt, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't just anger, but a profound, crystalline clarity. They thought they were throwing away a broken thing, a nuisance they could no longer afford to feed or look at, but they were actually releasing the only person in that house who knew how to build something from nothing. I looked back one last time at the darkened porch, the 60-watt light socket empty and cold, and I made a silent vow to the 38-degree night that I would never again be the person waiting for someone else to flip the switch. I would become my own light, a blinding, surgical-grade glare that would eventually illuminate every dark corner of the theft they had committed against me. The walk to the nearest bus stop was 3/4 of a mile, a journey that felt like a pilgrimage through an Arctic wasteland. But with every step, the girl who lived on Maple Lane was being replaced by a woman who understood the precise value of a life, a dollar, and a drop of blood. My mother might have had the oak staircase and the damp towel of her surrender, but I had the blue suitcase and the truth. And as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down through the darkness, I knew that the winter of my life was just beginning, and I intended to survive it until the spring came to burn their house down. The weight of that night would follow me into every trauma bay I ever worked in, a ghost in the machinery of my professional life that reminded me that the most dangerous wounds are often the ones that don't bleed externally. When I see a patient now with a 4-inch contusion on their wrist, I don't just see a soft tissue injury. I see the story of a door being locked, the sound of a security chain clicking into place, and the suffocating darkness of a 60-watt light being extinguished by a hand that should have been an anchor. I realized that night that family is a contract that the Dixon household had breached long before the suitcase hit the porch, and I was no longer bound by the terms of my own destruction. The $217 was a pittance, but it was enough for a bus ticket and a temporary reprieve from the cold. And as I sat on the hard plastic bench of the Greyhound station 3 hours later, I understood that Gerald hadn't just taken my money, he had given me the most expensive lesson a person can learn. He had taught me that survival is a solo mission, and that the only match for a cold heart is a mind that has been forged in the 38-degree reality of a frozen Pennsylvania porch. I looked at my wrist, the purple mark standing out against my pale skin like a brand, and I knew that one day I would walk back up those oak stairs, not as a victim seeking a refund, but as the person holding the bill for everything they had stolen. And on that day, no amount of blackjack winnings would be enough to pay what they owed me. I sat in the back of my Aunt Ruth's 2008 Chevrolet Impala, the interior smelling of stale Virginia Slims and the faint medicinal tang of the industrial-grade antiseptic they had used to clean my skin in the emergency room. It was exactly 2:45 in the morning, a time when the rest of the world seemed to be suspended in a heavy artificial slumber. But for me, it was the moment of a cold and clinical rebirth. The streetlights of the hospital parking lot cast long, distorted shadows across the cracked vinyl upholstery as I stared down at the crisp, white ER discharge papers clutched in my trembling left hand. My name, Presley Dixon, was printed in a sterile sans-serif font next to a series of numbers that felt like a new identity. Patient number 47. The clinical description of the injury, soft tissue hematoma, 4-inch contusion to the right distal radius and ulna, consistent with forceful manual compression, felt infinitely more real, more honest, and more tangible than my mother's whispered promises of love or her silent, tearful gazes. The black ink on that paper didn't lie. It didn't choose a husband over a child, and it didn't turn off a porch light in the middle of a freezing November night. I traced the edges of the form with my thumb, feeling the weight of the medical establishment acknowledging my pain in a way my own family never would. And I realized in that quiet, dark cabin of the Chevy that loyalty is a luxury I simply could not afford if I intended to survive the people who had birthed me. Aunt Ruth was my father's sister, a woman who had been estranged from the Maple Lane Colonial for years because she had the audacity to call Gerald a leech back in 2009, and she was the only person who answered my frantic, shivering call from the bus stop. She didn't ask for a long explanation, she didn't lecture me about honoring my parents, and she didn't try to mediate a peace that was already dead. She just drove 40 miles in a car with a slipping transmission to pick up a girl with a blue suitcase and a broken spirit. As she pulled out of the hospital lot, the 2008 Impala's engine humming with a rhythmic mechanical rattle, I felt the shift in my own internal gears. I was done with the emotional currency of a household that traded in gaslighting and theft. I looked out the window at the passing landscape of darkened strip malls and closed gas stations, and I understood that from this moment forward, I was an independent entity, a closed system that would no longer allow its resources to be drained by the parasitic needs of Gerald Dixon. We stopped at a 24-hour roadside diner called the Silver Skillet, a place where the fluorescent lights hummed with a harsh, unforgiving frequency, and the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and cheap grease. Aunt Ruth bought me a plate of scrambled eggs that I couldn't bring myself to eat, So instead, I reached for a stack of those thin, scratchy paper napkins tucked into the chrome dispenser on the table. I pulled out a ballpoint pen with a chewed-up cap from my backpack, the same backpack I had carried to a high school that I would likely never return to in the same capacity, and I began to calculate the literal and metaphorical cost of my survival. I didn't need a mother who stood on the stairs with a damp towel while I was being assaulted. I needed a career that provided me with the kind of institutional power they could never touch. I needed a spine of steel that wouldn't buckle when the people I loved tried to harvest my soul for their own convenience. Most importantly, I needed a paper trail that never expires, a documented history of their failures and my endurance that I could use as a shield whenever they tried to rewrite the narrative of our lives. On that napkin, beneath the coffee stains and the salt shakers, I wrote down a list of numbers that felt like a manifesto. Tuition for the local community college's nursing program, $4,800 a year. Cost of a used car that wouldn't die on the highway, $3,000. Minimum monthly expenses for a studio apartment in the city, $700. I was 16. I had $217 to my name, and I was staring at a deficit of thousands. But for the first time in my life, I felt a strange, icy sense of calm. The $14,300 Gerald had gambled away wasn't just money. It was the price of my silence, and since he had spent it, I was no longer obligated to keep his secrets. I realized that my value wasn't determined by the balance in a stolen bank account or the approval of a woman who was too afraid to speak up for her own flesh and blood. My value was in my ability to assess a situation, diagnose the rot, and amputate the parts that were killing me. I looked at the bruise on my wrist, which had deepened into a dark, angry obsidian color, and I saw it not as a mark of victimhood, but as the first piece of evidence in a lifelong case against the Dixon household. I began to map out the next decade of my life on those napkins, ignoring the pitying looks from the waitress who was refilling Aunt Ruth's mug. I decided right then that I would enter the medical field, not out of a soft-hearted desire to heal the world, but because hospitals were places of cold facts, rigorous documentation, and undeniable truth. I wanted to be the one holding the clipboard, the one signing the charts, the one whose testimony carried the weight of professional authority. I wanted to be a senior ER nurse at a level 1 trauma center because I wanted to see the worst the world had to offer and know that I was the one keeping the chaos at bay. I wanted to be Presley Dixon, BSN, RN, CCRN, a woman defined by her credentials and her competence, not by the blue suitcase that sat in the trunk of a 2008 Chevy. The napkins became crowded with my handwriting, a frantic but focused blueprint for a life built on the ruins of my childhood, and I felt the steel of my spine beginning to fuse together, replacing the soft, pliable cartilage of the daughter who used to hope for a birthday card. Every time Aunt Ruth shifted in her seat or the diner door opened to let in a gust of 38-degree air, I was reminded of the night's cruelty. But I used that cold to sharpen my resolve. I thought about the double bolt lock and the security chain that Gerald had clicked into place with such finality. They thought they were locking me out, but they were actually locking themselves in with their own decay. I was the only one who escaped that house with my integrity intact, even if it was battered and bruised. I realized that the paper trail I was starting tonight, the ER discharge papers, the police report I intended to file the next morning, the bank statements showing the zero balance, was the only inheritance I truly needed. It was a ledger of debt that they could never repay, a moral bankruptcy that would follow them even into the halls of the expensive hospitals they would one day frequent. I folded the napkins carefully, tucking them into the hidden pocket of my backpack alongside the discharge papers for patient number 47, and I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. My mother had her colonial on Maple Lane and her cognac leather bags, but I had the record of her cowardice, and in the world I was going to build, the record was the only thing that mattered. As we walked back out to the Chevy, the pre-dawn light was beginning to gray the edges of the horizon, revealing the frost-covered windshields of the cars in the diner lot. Aunt Ruth put her hand on my shoulder, a brief and hesitant gesture of support, but I didn't lean into it. I couldn't afford to lean on anyone anymore. I got back into the rear seat, staring at the blue suitcase that occupied the space where a friend or a sibling should have been, and I promised myself that I would never again be at the mercy of a 60-watt bulb controlled by someone else's hand. I was going to become the light that exposed them, the surgical glare that highlighted every lie and every theft they had committed under the guise of family. "My name is Presley Dixon," I told myself, as the Impala's heater finally began to blow lukewarm air against my face, "and I am no longer a daughter. I am a survivor with a plan." The drive to Aunt Ruth's cramped apartment in the city took another 45 minutes, and during every mile, I refined the architecture of my new life, building it out of the hard, unyielding materials of necessity and ambition. I thought about the future version of myself, the 28-year-old nurse who would one day stand on her own porch and face the woman who abandoned her. I knew that version of me would be strong, successful, and entirely indifferent to the pleas of a dying man who had gambled away her life. I knew that the $14,300 would be a distant memory, eclipsed by the hundreds of thousands I would earn through my own labor, but the 4-inch contusion on my wrist would remain as a ghostly imprint on my soul, a reminder of what happens when you trust people who value appearances over truth. I looked at the ER papers one last time before the sun came up, memorizing the clinical language of my trauma. Patient number 47, female, 16 years of age. I wasn't a person to the hospital. I was a case study, and I found a strange comfort in that objectivity. It was a baseline from which I could only ascend. By the time the Chevy pulled into the gravel driveway of Ruth's apartment complex, the girl who had been thrown out in the snow was gone, replaced by a technician of her own survival, a woman who knew that the most important thing she would ever own was the paper trail that proved she existed in spite of the people who tried to erase her. The napkins from the silver skillet were the first documents in my new archive, the foundation of a life where every action was calculated for maximum stability and every relationship was scrutinized for the risk of betrayal. I didn't need a mother's love, because a mother's love was a flickering porch light that could be extinguished in 5 seconds. I needed the career, the spine of steel, and the unshakable evidence of my own history. As I carried my blue suitcase up the stairs to Aunt Ruth's spare room, my wrist throbbing with the cold but my mind burning with a clear, singular purpose, I knew that the Dixon legacy was a house of cards, and I was the wind that was eventually going to blow it all down. I was 16, I was alone, and I was armed with nothing but a medical form and a few stained napkins. But in that moment, I felt more powerful than Gerald Dixon ever had in his expensive Stetson hat, because I had finally discovered the true cost of my freedom, and I was willing to pay it in full. The arsenal I had built over the last 12 years was not a collection of weapons in the traditional sense, but it was far more lethal to the carefully constructed facade of the Dixon family than any blade or bullet could ever hope to be. It existed as a 2-inch thick manila folder, heavy with the weight of documented betrayal and cold, hard evidence, kept inside a century-safe fireproof home safe, tucked away in the back of my bedroom closet beneath a stack of extra navy blue scrubs. This folder was my insurance policy, my shield, and the ultimate record of every moment they had tried to erase from their history books while I was busy surviving the fallout of their choices. Inside that folder, the very first document was the original 2014 emergency room report from my night as patient number 47. The paper slightly yellowed at the edges, but the ink still sharp and unforgiving as it detailed the soft tissue hematoma on my right wrist. Tucked right behind that medical record were high-resolution 4x6 glossy photographs I had taken with Aunt Ruth's help, showing the finger-shaped bruises that had bloomed across my skin like a dark violet map of Gerald's violence. Looking at those photos now, 12 years later, I could still feel the phantom pressure of his grip, but the images served as a permanent anchor to the truth that my mother, Colleen, had spent over a decade trying to drown in gin and suburban denial. Alongside the medical evidence sat a notarized affidavit from my former neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, a sharp-eyed woman who had been looking through her kitchen curtains on that freezing November night and had seen the entire spectacle of a 16-year-old girl being locked out of her own home. Mrs. Calloway had passed away 3 years ago, but her words lived on in that folder, stamped with a gold notary seal that gave her testimony a weight that my mother's silent glances could never counter. However, the most devastating components of my arsenal weren't just the relics of my past trauma, but the digital scans and financial records that Aunt Ruth had spent years helping me compile through public record searches and some very persistent private inquiries. Among these documents was a copy of Gerald's $42,000 gambling judgment from 2018, a legal ruling from the Superior Court of New Jersey that proved he hadn't stopped at my college fund, but had continued to bleed their own household dry at the blackjack tables of Atlantic City. The judgment was a jagged line of numbers that traced his descent from a mid-level executive with a silver Lexus to a desperate man who was one bad hand away from total insolvency. The final blow in the folder, the one that truly explained why my mother was currently standing on my porch with bloodshot eyes and a cognac leather bag, was a foreclosure notice on their 4,200-square-foot colonial on Maple Lane from exactly 8 months ago. The bank had finally come for the house with the oak staircase and the Swarovski crystal chandelier, the house where I was told I didn't belong, because the man who lived there had prioritized a soft 17 over the roof over his family's head. Seeing that document for the first time had been a moment of visceral, crystalline clarity for me because it proved that they hadn't come to my door out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of parental guilt or a desire for reconciliation. They hadn't tracked me down to say they were sorry for the snow, the bruises, or the stolen $14,300 from Grandma Vivian's account. They had tracked me down because I was the only asset they had left that hadn't been mortgaged, gambled away, or lost to a court judgment. I wasn't just a biological match for a kidney transplant to them. I was their last ATM, a biological resource they hoped to harvest to keep Gerald alive so he could continue his cycle of destruction while they clung to the wreckage of their social standing. The technical reality of their desperation was laid out in the black and white print of those foreclosure filings, which showed that they were currently 324 days delinquent on a mortgage that carried a monthly payment of $3,850. They were drowning in a sea of red ink, and Gerald's failing kidneys were simply the final physical manifestation of the rot that had started the day he decided a child's future was a tradable commodity. I sat on my sofa after Colleen had finally driven away in that idling Mercedes-Benz, and I pulled the manila folder out of the safe, spreading the documents across my coffee table like a deck of cards. I looked at the $42,000 judgment and compared it to the cost of the $400 Stetson hats he used to buy, and the math of their failure was staggering in its simplicity. They had traded a daughter who would have loved them for free for a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and a husband who viewed every person in his life as a chip to be played. Every document in that 2-inch thick folder represented a night I had spent working a double shift at the trauma center, every hour I had spent studying for my nursing boards while my peers were out at bars, and every moment I had felt the crushing weight of being truly alone in the world. This folder was my counter-narrative, the truth that would destroy the Dixon family's reputation if it ever saw the light of day in the circles they still tried to run in. I knew that my mother's request for a kidney wasn't just about saving a life. It was a tactical move to regain control over the one person who had managed to escape their orbit. If I gave them my kidney, I would be tethered to them forever by a medical bond and a debt of gratitude they would weaponize against me for the rest of my life. They would use my sacrifice to erase the 2014 ER report, to invalidate Mrs. Calloway's affidavit, and to make the 4-inch purple contusion on my wrist seem like a minor misunderstanding in the grand story of our family's resilience. But I was a senior ER nurse, and I knew how to read a chart. The prognosis for our relationship had been terminal the moment that double-bolt lock clicked into place. I traced the embossed seal on the foreclosure notice, feeling the texture of the paper, and I realized that my mother's designer handbag was likely the last thing she owned of any real value, a pathetic remnant of a life built on credit and theft. The irony of her standing on my porch, asking for a part of my body while she carried a cognac leather bag bought with money that likely should have been my tuition, was almost too much to bear. She had come to me because she knew I was successful, because she knew I had built a life of stability and consequence, but she hadn't bothered to consider that the very strength she was trying to exploit was forged in the fire of her own abandonment. I wasn't the 16-year-old girl under the flickering 60-watt porch light anymore. I was a woman with a fireproof safe and a paper trail that could ruin her husband's last shred of dignity. The manila folder was a testament to the fact that while they were blowing my grandmother's legacy on Atlantic City blackjack, I was building a case for my own independence that was beyond the reach of any gambler's luck. The weight of the 2-inch folder in my lap felt like a finality, a closure to the decade of wondering if I was the one who was wrong for being angry. The photos of the bruises didn't lie. The ER discharge papers for patient number 47 didn't lie, and the court's judgment on Gerald's debts didn't lie. They were the objective, clinical reality of a family that had failed in every measurable way. I thought about the 324 days of delinquent mortgage payments and the $42,000 in gambling debt, and I realized that Gerald wasn't just dying of renal failure, he was dying of the consequences of a life lived without a moral compass. He was looking for a match, but he was looking for a victim, and the woman I had become didn't fit the clinical criteria for a martyr. I was a survivor who kept her records in a fireproof safe, and as I tucked the manila folder back into its resting place, I knew that the next time they tried to come for me, I wouldn't be meeting them with a suitcase. I would be meeting them with the truth, documented, notarized, and ready to be served as the final bill for everything they had stolen from me. My name is Presley Dixon, and I am the only person in the world who knows the exact thickness of the lies that held the house on Maple Lane together. The 2-inch manila folder was my evidence, and the 60-second deadline I had given my mother was the beginning of the sentencing phase. I didn't need their colonial home or their Mercedes-Benz, and I certainly wasn't going to give them a piece of my physical self to keep their failing empire on life support for a few more months. I was a senior ER nurse at a level 1 trauma center, and I knew exactly when to call time of death. As the safe door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the quiet of my bedroom, I felt a sense of peace that was far more expensive and far more permanent than anything my grandmother's $14,300 could have ever bought. I was whole, I was documented, and I was finished being their ATM. The cold of the 2014 porch was finally, truly gone, replaced by the steady internal warmth of a woman who had saved her own life when no one else would. The trap was set with the kind of meticulous, sanctimonious precision that only a woman like Colleen Dixon could engineer, and the stage for my public execution, or rather my forced canonization, was the annual community health fundraiser held in the Fellowship Hall of Cedar Valley Church. It was a Sunday afternoon in late March, and the room was packed with approximately 150 people, all dressed in their finest Sunday best, creating a sea of pastel wool coats, polished Oxfords, and carefully coiffed hair that smelled faintly of expensive hairspray, and the cloyingly sweet aroma of $5 gourmet cinnamon rolls being sold at the back of the hall. The atmosphere was thick with a manufactured warmth, a communal sense of do-goodery that made my skin crawl the moment I stepped through the heavy oak double doors. I could see my mother standing at the mahogany podium, framed by 2 large arrangements of white lilies that looked more suited for a funeral than a fundraiser, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a delicate lace-edged handkerchief that I knew for a fact she had purchased specifically for this performance. She was playing the role of the grieving wife and the rediscovered mother with a virtuosity that would have earned her a standing ovation in any theater on Broadway, her voice trembling with a rehearsed tremor as she spoke into the silver gooseneck microphone about the medical miracle her family so desperately needed. She called me her prodigal daughter, a phrase that landed in the quiet room like a lead weight, dripping with a false narrative of rebellion and eventual submissive return. She spoke to the congregation, many of whom had watched me grow up and then watched me disappear without ever asking why, about the grace of God and the selflessness of family, painting a picture of a house on Maple Lane that was filled with love rather than the echoing silence of theft and the metallic click of a double-bolt lock. Every word she uttered was a calculated move in a high-stakes game designed to shame me into compliance, a public maneuver to secure a $500,000 medical miracle through the sheer pressure of communal expectation. The $500,000 represented the estimated total cost of Gerald's transplant, the subsequent hospital stay at a premier facility, and the years of post-operative care and anti-rejection medications that they couldn't afford because their own bank accounts were a wasteland of gambling debts and foreclosure notices. She was using the church, the community, and the very concept of maternal love as a weapon to bypass my autonomy, assuming that I wouldn't dare to shatter the stained glass image she was projecting in front of 150 witnesses. When she finished her speech, her face a mask of tragic hope, she stepped away from the podium and opened her arms wide, inviting me into a public hug that was meant to be the climax of her narrative, the visual confirmation that the daughter had returned to save the father. I could feel the collective breath of the room being held, the expectant smiles of neighbors who wanted to witness a happy ending they could discuss over brunch at the local country club. But I didn't move toward her. I didn't succumb to the gravitational pull of her performance or the suffocating pressure of the crowd's silent demand for my submission. Instead, I walked toward the stage with a slow, measured gait, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished linoleum floor, wearing my professional charcoal gray tailored slacks and a crisp white silk blouse that signaled my status as a clinician rather than a victim. I wasn't carrying a bouquet of forgiveness or a white flag of surrender. I was carrying the 2-inch thick manila folder, clutching it against my chest like a ballistic shield that had been forged in the fires of the last 12 years. I bypassed her outstretched arms, ignoring the way her face flickered from practiced grief to a sharp, jagged flash of panic as I stepped up to the mahogany podium and adjusted the microphone to my own height. The feedback from the speakers gave a low, sharp hum that cut through the murmurs of the crowd, demanding a silence that was absolute and heavy with sudden tension. I looked out at the faces in the audience. People like the Millers, who lived 3 doors down and never called when the police cruiser sat in our driveway, and the Henderson family, who had complimented Gerald on his Stetson hats while my college fund was being dissolved in Atlantic City. I didn't look at my mother, who was now standing frozen at the edge of the stage, her lace handkerchief crumpled in a fist that was beginning to shake with the realization that the script had been discarded. I placed the manila folder onto the lectern, the sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood echoing through the hall like a gavel, and I looked directly into the lens of the local community access camera that was recording the event for those who couldn't attend in person. "My name is Presley Dixon," I began, my voice amplified and steady, carrying the weight of the Level 1 trauma center shifts where I had learned to deliver the hardest truths without blinking. "For the last 10 minutes, you have heard a story about a prodigal daughter and a family's need for a miracle, but I am not here today as a character in someone else's play. I am here as a senior ER nurse, and I am here to provide a clinical correction to the records that have been presented to you this afternoon." The room shifted, a collective rustle of fabric as people leaned forward, their curiosity piqued by the shift from melodrama to cold, professional clarity. I opened the folder, the high-resolution photos of my 16-year-old wrist, the finger-shaped bruises captured in vivid 4x6 glossy detail resting on top of the stack. I didn't hold them up yet. I let the presence of the documentation speak for itself as I continued, my eyes scanning the room with a detached surgical precision that made more than a few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. I spoke about the reality of the 2014 ER report for patient number 47, detailing the atmospheric temperature of 38 degrees and the 60-watt porch light that was extinguished 5 seconds after I was locked out of my own home. I mentioned the $14,300 that had been systematically withdrawn from my grandmother's estate at the blackjack tables of the Borgata, a sum that would have paid for the very education that allowed me to stand here today. I saw Gerald sitting in the front row, his face turning a sickly, mottled shade of gray as he realized that the manila folder contained the $42,000 gambling judgment from 2018 and the foreclosure notice that proved their colonial on Maple Lane was no longer their own. The smell of the cinnamon rolls suddenly seemed nauseating, a sugary veneer over the rot I was systematically exposing to the light of the fellowship hall. I wasn't there to ask for their money or their pity. I was there to serve the final bill for the 60-hour weeks I had worked as a CNA for $8.60 an hour, while my stepfather was wearing a $400 hat bought with my stolen future. Colleen tried to move toward the microphone, a desperate attempt to regain control of the room, her voice a hissed whisper of Presley. "Stop this right now. Think of your father." I didn't even turn my head toward her. I simply turned the manila folder around so that the primary document, the notarized affidavit from Mrs. Calloway, was visible to the front 3 rows. "This isn't about a kidney," I said, the words ringing out with a finality that silenced any lingering thoughts of a reconciliation hug. "This is about a transaction. My mother came to my door seeking a biological resource because they have exhausted every other credit line and every other person who ever trusted them. They aren't looking for a daughter. They are looking for a donor they can guilt into silence. But as a medical professional, I know that a transplant requires a healthy environment to succeed, and this family is a toxic waste site." I watched as the 150 people in their Sunday best began to look at each other, the illusion of the Dixon medical miracle dissolving into the reality of a sordid domestic crime scene. The $500,000 goal on the large thermometer chart at the back of the room suddenly seemed absurd, a monument to a lie that I had just dismantled with 2 inches of documented truth. I closed the folder, the sound once again punctuated by the absolute stillness of the congregation, and I felt the weight of 12 years of silence finally lifting from my shoulders. I had spent a decade building a spine of steel and a career that couldn't be touched by their bankruptcy, and standing at that podium, I realized that I had finally achieved the ultimate form of survival. I was the one telling the story now, and I was the one who controlled the ending. I looked at the community members, some of whom were now looking down at their laps in shame, and I felt a profound sense of indifference toward their judgment. I wasn't there for their approval any more than I was there for my mother's hug. I was there to ensure that the paper trail I had meticulously preserved was finally entered into the public record, making it impossible for Gerald and Colleen to ever again hide behind the facade of the colonial on Maple Lane. As I stepped down from the stage, the manila folder tucked firmly under my arm, the silence in the Cedar Valley Church Fellowship Hall was so thick it felt like a physical barrier. I walked past my mother, whose eyes were now wide with a mixture of hatred and total, irreversible defeat, and I didn't stop until I reached the double doors. I could hear the faint, frantic whispering of the crowd starting up behind me, the sound of 150 people beginning to process the fact that they had been invited to a fundraiser for a thief and a coward. I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the scent of the cinnamon rolls finally fading, replaced by the clean, sharp smell of the coming spring. My name is Presley Dixon, and I had just performed the most successful operation of my life. I had surgically removed the Dixon family from my future, and for the first time in my 28 years, the record was finally perfectly clear. I didn't need a medical miracle to be whole, I just needed the truth. And as I walked toward my car, leaving the mahogany podium and the lace tissues behind, I knew that the prodigal daughter was never coming back, because the woman who had taken her place was far too busy living a life that was finally her own. Let us talk about the prodigal daughter narrative that has been so carefully woven for you today like a shroud designed to bury the truth, I said. My voice projected with a clinical, unwavering strength that resonated at a measured 85 decibels through the vaulted ceiling of the Cedar Valley Church Fellowship Hall. I did not scream. I did not let my voice crack with the tremors of a victim, and I did not give them the satisfaction of a daughter lost in the throes of an emotional breakdown. Instead, I used the same steady, authoritative tone I use when calling out vitals in a crowded trauma bay where every second counts. I looked out at the 150 people who had just been ready to applaud my submission, and I opened the manila folder to the very first page, the ink of the 2014 emergency room report, stark and undeniable under the harsh fluorescent lighting. I began to read the cold, objective language of the medical record, my words cutting through the scent of $5 cinnamon rolls and the cloying sweetness of my mother's staged grief. November 14th, 2014, I read, my eyes scanning the document with surgical precision. A female minor brought into the emergency department by a neighbor at approximately 11:45 p.m. with a deep hematoma on the right wrist. Patient was coatless and shivering with a core temperature of 96.4 degrees. And most importantly, the record states in black and white that no parent was present. No parent responded to multiple phone calls, and the minor was treated as a ward of the state for the duration of her stay. I reached into the folder and pulled out the high-resolution 4x6 glossy photographs I had preserved for 12 years, holding them up high so that the front rows could see the dark, obsidian-colored, finger-shaped bruises that had been burned into my 16-year-old skin by the man sitting in the front row. The room went silent enough to hear a pin drop on the polished linoleum, a heavy, suffocating silence that replaced the murmurs of sympathy with the cold realization that they were witnessing a crime scene rather than a family reunion. I watched the pastor's face, a man who had spent the last 20 minutes looking at me with a soft, patronizing pity, shift in real time as the color drained from his cheeks and his expression curdled into one of pure, unadulterated horror. He looked from the photos of my battered wrist to the woman standing beside him at the podium, and for the first time, he saw Colleen Dixon not as a grieving wife, but as a silent accomplice to the physical and financial destruction of her own child. The air in the hall felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum as the weight of the evidence settled over the congregation, and just as my mother opened her mouth to offer another rehearsed lie, a chair scraped against the floor in the third row. Mrs. Calloway, who was now 84 years old but still possessed a voice like a sharpening stone, stood up with a dignity that silenced any remaining doubt in the room. "I was there," she stated, her eyes fixed on the back of Gerald's head with a piercing clarity that made him flinch. "I was the one who saw that child standing on the porch in 38-degree weather while the lights were turned off on her, and I was the one who heard the double-bolt lock click into place when she had nowhere else to go." She confirmed every detail of that night, her testimony acting as a second notarized anchor that pinned my mother's perfect family narrative to the floor and left it to wither under the heat of the truth. I watched the sweat begin to bead on Gerald's forehead, his expensive Stetson hat now looking like a ridiculous costume, as he realized that the 150 people he had tried to manipulate were now looking at him with the same revulsion they would show a predator. Colleen's carefully curated image of suburban grace and maternal devotion evaporated instantly under the relentless glare of the 3 notarized documents I laid out on the mahogany podium. I didn't just have the ER report and the neighbor's affidavit. I had the final killing blow, the record of the $14,300 stolen from my grandmother's account, tracked through ATM withdrawals that occurred on the very same weekends Gerald claimed to be away on business. The technicality of their betrayal was now a public record, a ledger of sin that no amount of church fundraisers or lace tissues could ever wipe clean. I looked at my mother, who was clutching the edge of the podium so hard her knuckles were white, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. She had brought me here to be a biological sacrifice for a $500,000 medical miracle, but she had failed to realize that I was a senior ER nurse at a level 1 trauma center, and I knew exactly how to find the pulse of a lie and stop it dead. The contrast between the woman she wanted me to be, the submissive, forgiving, prodigal daughter, and the woman I actually was, the technician of my own survival, was a chasm that she could never hope to bridge. I felt a sense of crystalline peace as I watched the social standing they had spent decades building crumble into dust in a matter of minutes. The people in the pews weren't reaching for their checkbooks anymore. They were reaching for their coats, their eyes averted from the stage as they realized they had been invited to participate in a fraud. I stood there for a long moment, the manila folder empty on the lectern and the photos of my bruises still visible to the room, and I realized that the 60-watt porch light they had turned off 12 years ago had finally been replaced by a blinding, permanent sun that would never allow them to hide in the shadows again. My name is Presley Dixon, and I was no longer a ward of the state or a match for a gambler's failing organs. I was the architect of my own justice, and the bill I had just served to the Dixon family was one that no amount of blackjack winnings would ever be able to satisfy. I turned back to the microphone one last time, my voice still hovering at that commanding 85 decibels, ensuring that every single person in the fellowship hall heard my final assessment of the situation. "This isn't a fundraiser for a medical miracle," I said, my gaze sweeping over the frozen figures of Gerald and Colleen. "This is a liquidation sale for a family that went morally bankrupt a long time ago." I watched the pastor take a step back from them, a physical distancing that signaled the total collapse of their support system within the community they had used as a shield. The smell of the cinnamon rolls was now sour and heavy, matching the atmosphere of the room as the realization of their theft and cruelty settled into the bones of everyone present. I didn't wait for a rebuttal, and I didn't wait for the pastor to find his words. I began to gather my documents with a slow, deliberate calmness, tucking the photos of my 16-year-old self back into the manila folder as if I were tucking a child into bed. I had protected her today, the girl who stood in the 38-degree snow, and that was worth more than any kidney or any $500,000 donation. As I walked off the stage, the silence followed me like a respectful guard, the 150 guests parting to create a wide path as I headed for the exit. I passed the donation thermometer at the back of the hall, the red marker still stuck at the bottom, a visual representation of a failure that was entirely of their own making. I walked out of Cedar Valley Church and into the cool, fresh air of the afternoon, feeling the weight of the 2-inch thick folder in my hand as a comfort rather than a burden. My mother's lace tissue was likely sitting on the floor of the stage now, a discarded prop from a play that had been canceled mid-act, and Gerald was left to face the reality of his own decaying body without the benefit of the flesh he thought he could steal. I reached my car, a reliable and paid-for vehicle that represented every hour of my own hard work, and I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the world outside. I thought about the 4-inch purple contusion from 2014 and how it had finally transformed into the strength I needed to walk away from the wreckage of Maple Lane once and for all. The prodigal daughter narrative was dead, buried under the weight of 3 notarized documents and the testimony of a woman who had been watching through her kitchen curtains. I was Presley Dixon, 28 years old, a senior ER nurse who handled life and death every day, and I had just saved the most important life of all, my own. I started the engine, the sound of the car a steady, reassuring vibration that signaled the beginning of the rest of my life, a life where the only matches I cared about were the ones that led to healing and truth. As I pulled out of the church parking lot, leaving the triple-bolt locks and the 60-watt porch lights in the rearview mirror, I knew that the winter of my soul was finally over, and the spring that followed was going to be the brightest thing I had ever seen. The documents in the safe were no longer an arsenal for a future battle. They were the historical records of a victory that had been won the moment I refused to be an ATM for the people who had tried to erase me. I drove home to my cottage, the one I had bought with my own savings, and I realized that the only thing colder than the woman who had stood on my porch was the realization that she no longer had any power to make me shiver. The aftermath of the exposure at the Cedar Valley Church Fellowship Hall was total and instantaneous, resembling the rapid collapse of a structural failure that had been hidden behind fresh paint and expensive wallpaper for far too long. By Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, the social and financial scaffolding that Colleen and Gerald Dixon had spent decades constructing had completely disintegrated under the weight of the documented truth I had laid bare on that mahogany podium. The church elders, led by a pale and visibly shaken Pastor Miller, met in an emergency session and formally withdrew the emergency support fund that had been intended to bankroll Gerald's $500,000 medical miracle. The red ink on the donation thermometer in the hall remained frozen at 0, a silent and public indictment of the theft and cruelty that had defined the Dixon household behind closed doors. My mother, who had spent years cultivating her image as a pillar of the community, received a cold 3-sentence notification that she had been removed from the church planning committee and all future charitable endeavors, effective immediately. The neighborhood of Oak Haven, which thrived on a currency of appearances and whispered reputations, turned its back on the colonial house on Maple Lane with a speed that was almost clinical in its efficiency. As for the medical reality of the situation, the technical facts remained unchanged even as the moral landscape shifted beneath our feet. I was indeed a perfect biological match for Gerald's kidney transplant, a cruel irony of genetics that linked my healthy tissue to his failing systems. However, as Dr. Arthur Webb, the chief of transplant surgery at St. Vincent's Medical Center, told me during a private consultation in his sterile, quiet office, the ethics of the procedure were non-negotiable and absolute. "Consent is voluntary, Presley," he said, his eyes reflecting a deep professional understanding of the conflict etched into my medical history. No hospital in the country will compel a donor to undergo a major surgical procedure to save a man who has been documented as her abuser, and no ethical board will overlook the 4-inch purple contusion and the 2014 ER report when evaluating the psychological readiness of a living donor. I sat in that ergonomic leather chair, looking at the anatomical charts on the wall and the high-resolution scans of my own healthy kidneys, and I felt the final heavy link of the chain of obligation snap and fall away. I was a senior ER nurse. I understood the sanctity of life more than most, but I also understood that a life bought with the coerced sacrifice of a victim is a life that has already lost its integrity. I decided that the silence I had maintained for 12 years was over, but I had one final piece of documentation to return to its sender before I closed the door on the Dixon name forever. I sat at my desk in my cottage, the morning sun filtering through the windows and illuminating the polished wood floors I had worked 60-hour weeks as a CNA to eventually afford, and I opened my personal fireproof safe one last time. I pulled out a single cream-colored envelope that had arrived at Aunt Ruth's apartment in late 2018, a letter from my mother that I had never opened, sensing even then that it was filled with the same gaslighting and hollow excuses that characterized her lace-tissue performances. I scanned the envelope into a high-resolution PDF, the stamp and the elegant cursive handwriting of Colleen Dixon looking like a relic from a dead civilization. I attached that file to a final clinical email addressed to my mother, a digital delivery of the silence she had earned through her complicity. I didn't write a long, emotional diatribe, and I didn't ask for the $14,300 back. I simply wrote that the ledger was closed and that the daughter she had thrown out in the 38-degree snow was officially declaring her own independence from their debt. I have my own house now, a 3-bedroom craftsman that smells of cedar and real coffee, and I have a career as a senior ER nurse at a Level 1 trauma center where my name is spoken with respect and my authority is backed by years of grueling, honest labor. My life is no longer a series of calculated maneuvers to avoid Gerald's rage or Colleen's disappointment. It is a solid, unyielding structure built on a foundation of truth and self-reliance. I have surrounded myself with a family of choice, people like Aunt Ruth, my fellow trauma nurses, and the friends who stood by me when I was eating 18-cent ramen, who understand that loyalty is earned through consistency and that love is not a transaction involving biological organs or stolen tuition funds. We gathered in my kitchen on that Monday evening, the air filled with the scent of a home-cooked meal that wasn't bought with a gambler's winnings, and I realized that the warmth of my own home was a permanent state of being, not a 60-watt bulb that could be switched off by a coward's hand. The technical specifications of my survival were now complete, the paper trail in the 2-inch thick manila folder serving as the final blueprint for a life that was entirely my own. Gerald would have to find his miracle elsewhere, perhaps from a stranger who didn't know the sound of his double-bolt lock, or from a list that didn't take into account his history of domestic theft. My mother would have to face the foreclosure on Maple Lane without the benefit of a daughter to blame or a kidney to sell, her Michael Kors bags and lace tissues finally revealed as the cheap props they always were. As I sat at my table, looking at the faces of the people who actually showed up when the world was freezing over, I felt a sense of profound, immovable peace. Family is not a matter of shared blood or a common last name. Family is the person who holds the door open when the nor'easter is blowing, the person who doesn't look for a match in your flesh but a partner in your spirit. My name is Presley Dixon, and for the first time in my 28 years, I wasn't waiting for the aftermath to hit. I was the aftermath, a force of nature that had survived the winter to build a spring that was finally, perfectly, and irreversibly mine. The email was sent at 10:15 a.m., and as I clicked the send button, I felt the last of the 38-degree chill leave my bones for good. The PDF of the unopened letter was a symbol of the boundaries I had spent a decade hardening, a digital boundary that no amount of church fundraisers or cognac leather bags could ever penetrate. I thought about the 4-inch contusion on my wrist and how it had faded into a memory, replaced by the muscle and the skill of a woman who saves lives every single day. I walked out onto my porch, not the frozen planks of Maple Lane, but the sturdy, welcoming wood of my own sanctuary, and I listened to the sound of the world continuing to turn without the Dixon family's influence. The 60-second deadline I had given my mother had turned into a lifetime of distance, and the silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I was whole, I was free, and I was finished being the person who waited for a light to be turned on. I was my own light now, a brilliant and surgical glare that had exposed the rot and left me standing in the clean, clear air of my own integrity. I remembered the sound of the double-bolt lock from 2014, but it no longer resonated in my chest as a trauma. It was now just a technical detail in a story that had a much better ending than the one they had written for me. I looked at my hands, the hands that Dr. Webb had said were capable of giving a medical miracle, and I knew that they were better used for healing the strangers who came through my trauma bay with hope in their eyes, rather than the man who had tried to gamble them away. My worth was never something for Gerald Dixon to decide, and my future was never something for Colleen Dixon to pack into a $45 blue suitcase. I am Presley Dixon, a senior ER nurse, a homeowner, and a woman who knows exactly what her life is worth. The paper trail is complete, the arsenal is retired, and the house on Maple Lane is a dark, empty shell that no longer has the power to make me shiver. I turned back into my warm, bright kitchen, leaving the past in the scent folder where it belonged, and I began to prepare for the next shift, knowing that the only match I would ever need was the one I found in the mirror every single morning.